Hello everybody, welcome back to Indycar on Wednesday morning. My name is Gordon Ross, and today I'm talking about secession, the act of creating a new country from another. In other words, removing part of one country from another and creating a new state, something which Scotland will need to do when it becomes independent. In the last few days there have been some running arguments between independence campaigners on how Scotland can separate from England legally and still be recognised by other states in the world. Also, I think there's been very little education of the public here about what the general parameters are for a seceding country, what requirements you have to meet in order to be recognised as having seceded in the first place and for you to be accepted as a new nation afterwards. So there are some generalisations that you can make on this subject, and they are not, I'm not going to put these in legal terms, but the first of these is that there must be a recognisable grouping of people who identify as a state first of all. Now that is not an issue for Scotland because it is an extant state. It already is a country, and the people who live here already identify as Scotland, as Scottish. So that's the first issue. That's not a problem. The next issue is that region and its people have to show a history of having been marginalised and excluded from the running of the larger state. Now that again is a given. We can show that we have been largely excluded and marginalised for the last 3 centuries quite easily. The evidence is all there, and the most recent evidence of which is, of course, the snubbing of any efforts by the Scottish Government to take part or to advise or to even be consulted upon the process of Brexiting from the European Union. So that's the next one. We have to have been marginalised. So we have been marginalised. Another issue, another box ticked in the list of things to do before you secede. Now, other interesting things that you need to have in place. First of all, we need to have a functioning government which is capable of running the country. Tick box 3, we've already got that. Okay, we have a functioning government which runs the country perfectly well. It's not perfect, it cocks things up now and again, but puts them right eventually, and we have a full democratic system for holding them to account. They can be removed anytime we like through normal democratic means. So we have a full democratically elected working government in place. Tick box 3. Okay, so that's out of the way. What do we need next? Well, the next thing is a strange one, but you'd think this would be a given. First of all, we need a majority of the population in Scotland to vote for independence, to be in favour of it, and to show that in some legally constituted ballot. All right, it doesn't specify what kind of ballot, but some kind of democratic ballot, which is overseen by international observers to be fair. That doesn't necessarily need a Section 30 order, but when we come to the next box, let's say we've ticked box 4 to say that we've had a referendum, we've had a ballot, and we voted in majority to secede. We also need to get the agreement of the country that we are seceding from, and we have to be able to demonstrate that by seceding from this other group that we are not going to bankrupt their economy in the process. Now that means we need to negotiate. It means that part of the process is after you get this yes vote, that you then need to negotiate with the original larger state so that there is an even division of resources, there is a clear identification of overlaps in the economy where the countries will work together and where they will legislate on their own. So there need to be demarcation lines drawn. So we have to get not just agreement from England and Wales, but we have to satisfy ourselves and the rest of the UK that by seceding we're not going to damage ourselves, and we will be able to support and protect our new economy and our people, and that England and Wales will be able to do the same thing. So there has to be a quid pro quo after the yes vote in order for us to be recognised by other states as a viable, new, democratic and acceptable state. We have to show this reasonable negotiating with the British government so that the assets of both can be divided fairly so that each country goes its separate ways without having damaged the other. So this is something that hasn't been spoken about very much, and I've spoken a little bit about the fact that I think we need to do some horse trading with things like oil and gas in order to ensure that we have a smooth separation, that there's no ill will, and that we continue to trade with the country that we've seceded from. Now, other nations have done this in the past. One of the examples that is often quoted is South Sudan, which seceded from Sudan. Sudan had a cultural sort of leftover problem where the north of Sudan was predominantly Muslim and the south predominantly non-Muslim, and the south felt marginalised and seceded from the north, and they did so in the way I've just described. They went through these steps where there was a peaceful demonstration. They ticked the boxes. They had a clearly identified group of people who identified as, in those days, South Sudanese, who felt marginalised, and they could demonstrate that, who then had a vote, a ballot which was legally enforced and was watched by international observers. They then negotiated with North Sudan, and they negotiated a fair settlement, and they worked out who would get how much oil, who would get how much gas, because they had these in common, and they worked out an agreement which damaged neither country. And so the two countries separated successfully, and South Sudan became a sovereign state with its own government. So it can be done. Now, one other thing that is interesting about this, and I'm going to try and keep this short because I don't want to send everybody to sleep. Once you have got to the point where you've said yes, you've had your vote, and you have negotiated with your neighbour, you have a clean separation and a fair distribution of resources, then an agreement is drawn up between the two countries which establishes the new state's relationship with the old. So they become separate states and you can declare your independence. In order to be fully accepted by the rest of the world's nations, you have to go through these steps. Somebody claimed recently that we'd have to join the UN in order to be accepted. This is actually not the case. You could join the UN if you wanted to be accepted by UN members, but there is a sticking point in the UN, which is that as long as 9 out of the 15 permanent members of the United Nations agree to you joining the UN, then you get in. But there's a veto, and the veto includes America, many of the European nations which were first to sign up, including the UK, and any one of them can veto your membership of the UN. So there's a little fly in the ointment. So if the British state decided to take the hump, they might try and shut you out of the UN. However, the UN is not vital. What is vital is that we go through the steps I've just described. And in that way, the country can be recognised across the globe as having gone through these steps in a peaceful way, negotiated with its previous government to secede in a way which damages both nations the least. But as I've said, we have to be able to demonstrate that we have a functioning government and an economy which can support and protect the new state. And that would include eventually the formation of some kind of defensive force to protect Scottish territory and civilians and installations and assets. And that would be done later. But we'd have to prove, first of all, that we have the means to do that. And that would require, first of all, I think, for us to negotiate with the United Kingdom to ensure that we have a fair distribution of the natural resources that we have at our disposal. And we can do that quite easily by negotiating. Some people have claimed that Scotland leaving the United Kingdom would bankrupt England, Wales, and what's left of Northern Ireland if it's still there. Frankly, I think that's an oversimplification, because the English economy, despite being built largely on borrowing, still has a great deal of creditworthiness with the international banks, and would easily be able to borrow what it needed to smooth the lumps and bumps along the way after we seceded. But on the other hand, they do also need to have a clearly defined share of things like oil and gas revenues from their sectors of the North Sea, and maybe negotiations over trading, say, some of Scotland's oil, because we have more of it, for some of England's gas, because they have more of that. So there are ways of balancing things out, and I don't think that England would be bankrupted by us leaving, because if it were, then they would never agree to this. And we need to have their agreement. We need to have a fair settlement. Otherwise, this won't be accepted by international bodies of any kind, not just the UN. So it is important that we take a reality pill here and look at the realities of this and look at how other countries have done it in the past. We have ticked all of the boxes so far. What remains to be done is for us to have the ballot, and when we have the ballot, to then negotiate with the rest of the United Kingdom over how we separate, who gets what, and a fair deal which doesn't damage either country, and so that we have an agreement or some kind of trading alliance afterwards, so that we can continue to trade across our borders as we have done for centuries. This is one of the issues which many anti-independence campaigners are always citing, that we would put a border up between Scotland and England. I don't think that is necessary. It's quite easy for both England and Scotland to maintain their own borders, and also to check those who are crossing the border into and out of England. It can be done. The British government said it can be done in Northern Ireland, so I think if it can be done in Northern Ireland, it can be done here even more easily, because our border is much, much smaller. We have something like a 90-mile border, whereas Northern Ireland's border is drawn over about 300 miles. It's very difficult to get any kind of security on it. So those are my comments today. I'm sure there will be other people who might take issue with this, but the generalities I've described here are what is the accepted norm for becoming a new state. We go through these stages. We have a clearly defined number of people who identify as part of the state. They have to have been marginalised, which we can certainly prove. They have to then vote in favour of it, which I think we can do. They also have to have a functioning government, which we do, and a functioning economy sufficient to support the new state, which we do. And that just leaves us with voting and negotiating with England, because that really is the crux of it. We have to vote and then negotiate, and then we declare independence and we can be accepted. There will be emissaries, I am certain, from Scottish Government in informal talks with many different European and non-European countries to gain their support, or the pledge of support, if we vote yes. So they can come out and say, well, Scotland has voted yes, we agree that they are a sovereign state, and we will support them and support their acceptance as members of the EU, or as members of the Free Trade Association, or as members of the UN, whichever body it is. These things have to happen in a particular order, and we are about, I think, somewhere in the region of 4/6 of the way there. We have 2-3 more steps to get through before we're there. But we're well on the road, and despite what people say about Section 30 orders, there is nothing in international law which states that you have to get the absolute agreement of the entire country you're seceding from in order to have a ballot. Because Scotland is unique in that its laws are separate from England's law, and we can legislate to have our own ballot. We are in an unusually powerful state, actually, or state in terms of our situation rather than the country, but we're in an unusual situation where we can legislate for our own referendums without a Section 30 order, and those will provide the information on the numbers of people supporting becoming an independent country, separating from the UK. So that's all I have to say. I'm trying to give some clearer information so people have something a little bit more concrete to work with. These subjects can get fantastically complicated, so what I've outlined to you is just one scenario which is used as a yardstick in international law generally to decide these things. But as I say, remember that Great Britain has a veto in the UN, so has France, and so has the United States. So I think let's leave the UN aside for the moment and just deal with the generality of the rest of the nations of the world and gain their acceptance. The UN can come later. I think to start looking at the UN as a way to acceptance is going to be fraught with difficulties. We have too many difficult negotiations to do first before we can really do that. It would need, first of all, the yes vote, successful negotiation with London, declaration of independence agreed by both, and then we could look at joining the UN, because then the UK would not use its veto. Anyway, those are the facts as I understand them, and hopefully these will help you when you're talking to other people about independence and the process of it. I'll see you tomorrow. Bye for now.